All right, my guest today on Business for the Culture is Fernando Martinez. Now, he is with the National Minority Supplier Development Council's national office. He's the Senior Vice President of Network Success, and he's responsible for enhancing the growth of the national minority business enterprises. And he's coming to talk to us about how you can get access to government contracts, the how, the where, the what we need to do, and questions that many of you all have submitted. So thank you for coming, Fernando. Welcome to AURN Business for the Culture.
Ebony, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Nice to be here.
Now, I have so many questions that people sent into me when I said we were going to have this conversation. But before we kick off, because many people don't know what MSNBC, NMS, sorry, but I'm telling you, it is like a tongue twister for me. But for what NMSDC really does. So for those who are like, what is it that you do and how can you help me? Just briefly tell our audience.
Sure, absolutely. The National Minority Supplier Development Council, Ebony, the NMSDC, is a national organization focused on the development and growth of the ethnic minority business community. And when I say the ethnic minority business community, I'm referring to the Black businesses, brown businesses, Asian American businesses, Native American, Alaska Native businesses. So we're the only organization in the country that does multicultural business development. And our footprint is we have a national office that operates 23 regional offices across the country. So just about in every major city, Atlanta, Seattle, Miami, Los Angeles, New York, we have offices that are open to support minority businesses in those particular regions because each office is responsible for a specific region, for a specific geocode. And so, for example, our Detroit Council does all of Michigan. Our Seattle Council does the Northwest region. So absolutely. And the importance of this, Ebony, is that we really focus on private sector and public sector in helping companies get involved with these entities. And this is where we drive revenue. This is where we create networks. This is where we create business, and this is where we help them develop and grow and begin to build that multi-generational wealth. And that's the key for us. It is how do we impact our communities today, but how do we begin to build generational wealth in such a way that our future generations are going to be in a better position than we are today?
Now, I know the organization has set a $1 trillion goal. Go into what that goal is that you all have set.
Absolutely. And so when Ying McGuire came in about 2 years ago, she says, we're great at what we do, but we need to do more. And so she set this aspirational goal of 1 trillion for certified minority businesses. Right now, we're at about 316 billion in terms of how much our businesses generate, which means that we have to, one, allow the natural growth to occur, two, stimulate additional growth through our partnerships with our corporations and our public sector agencies, and three, continue to pull more of the MBEs from our community into our network so that we can achieve that goal. Our aspirational goal is to achieve it by 2030. Which is a big mark, which means that we have to keep growing at a pace of about 20%. And so that's a very, very high goal. But like everything, if we strive for spectacular, we get excellence. If we strive for excellence, we get great. If we strive for great, we get good. So this aspirational goal is one of those spectacular goals that Ying has set aside for us so that we can hit that mark.
I want to end up talking about the support that the organization provides. When I was doing this, like I was saying before, I was so disturbed at some of the numbers when it talks about how much contracting dollars are not awarded to minority businesses. So in fiscal year 2020, the federal government spent over $650 billion on contracts for goods and services, and nearly $560 billion was eligible to be done through small businesses. Yet, within those numbers, minority-owned small businesses received just 9.4%. Of those small businesses eligible for federal contracting dollars, women-owned small businesses got 4.9%. And so we know that every year the U.S. government purchases these billions of dollars worth of goods and services through these contracts, but it feels like the minority-owned businesses keep being left out. Now, when we spoke the first time, I know the Biden-Harris administration was trying to take very historic steps to bring access to capital and fill some of the lending gaps in underserved communities. Explain what those actions were and what that means to Black and Brown communities.
So thank you, Ebony. So access to capital continues to be a barrier that we have to continue to fight against, right? And so with all this funding that the federal government has made with the Biden administration, we see banks lending more specifically, more intentionally to businesses of color. We see banks really creating programs that help build and develop these businesses, right? So in the other hand, it's also these banks are also helping our minority businesses by saying, hey, we're going to fund this particular level of development and certification for you so that you can then begin to be part of that network. So the banking institutions have taken a good step towards funding businesses. That's not the end all, right? What we also have to do is at the National Minority Supplier Development Council, we have programs also where we help put together minority businesses with funding institutions, which will help meld the two together so that there's growth, right? Because if access to capital is a challenge and we bring these capital providers to them, now that melding creates an opportunity for growth. And it also creates that internal infrastructure of funding that enables growth, right? Now, one thing that I think is important for people to note is that most companies will look at an organization's financials, and they will look at what are the financials, and they will not contract with anybody for more than 25%, right? Because the reason for that is because they intentionally do this for a couple of reasons. One is they don't want to put anybody in a position to where all of a sudden everything falls into all their revenue and all their infrastructure and all their services are hosted towards or geared towards one company. So when they look at this 25%, they're looking at it from a perspective of like, one, we want to help them grow, but two, we want to protect them from imploding. So that's one thing. The other thing that this does is this enables the minority businesses to really begin to build a portfolio to where the broader your portfolio gets, the broader the opportunities for capital. So one, the banking institutions are doing some really good things and funding development growth programs. Two, the National Minority Supplier Development Council is really looking at how to meld funding capitalists and capital firms, especially minority capital firms, right, which are very few. So how do we bring the two together so that it's truly a minority-owned firm, right? And then three, the companies are really looking to see how they can help companies grow themselves.
Let's kind of dig into that just a little bit, because when I did look at the numbers in 2021, Black-owned firms received just 13% of all the financing that they applied for versus 20% Hispanic-owned, 31% Asian-owned, and 40% white-owned firms. So like you said, access to capital is a huge issue facing businesses. So can you be specific more about, I'm coming to NMSDC, how will this help me? And especially if I'm a startup firm. How are you helping me with access as a startup firm? How should I set my expectations?
So one thing about the NMSDC, Ebony, is that we partner with other agencies, right? We partner with like the Minority Business Development Agency, the MBDA, which is a legislated entity within the federal government now, right? They just legislated it 2 years ago. We also partner with entities like the Small Business Administration, right? Because working in the private sector and working in the public sector, sometimes for startups, it's a little bit difficult to get into those markets. So we work with the SBA, the MBDA, to make sure that we get them the right baseline of how to run a business, how to start a business, how to think about the business, so that then they can begin to build their portfolio, starting small and then moving into the bigger sector, right? We're not looking at not including everybody, but we want to make sure that when they're ready to do business with the government, or they're ready to do business with the private sector, that they have that readiness availability, right? So we look at it, we're trying to make sure that we look at it from their capacity to scale, from their capabilities to perform, from their contractual history. We're looking at it from making sure that they have the right licenses and certifications to perform in those industries, because absent one of those, it's also going to detract from these companies doing business with minority businesses, right? Here's the thing about those statistics that you just gave right now, Ebony. We all know that historically, there's been redlining, right? We can trace it back to the 60s. And
absolutely, racism is a big, and I don't want to make it an elephant in the room, because as we get into some of the other questions, much of this has to do with racism, even though we may call it other names or say we use different terms, but in the end, some of these exclusions that minority contractors have gone through are because of issues with race, which is why I'm glad for the work that this organization does.
Absolutely. And so, you know, there's now more, even with all the funding that the Biden administration has done, they've created funds for more affordable housing, right? So the banks have to play with their Community Reinvestment Act, and so they have to play in the affordable housing bill, right? But we still see where there's still some challenges there, right? And now it's about how do we provide business funding, same qualifications, the same revenue, right? Because we have to make sure that the business is paying the same for borrowing money, whether you're black, brown, or white. So we have to level that play field. And one of the things that I think is important is that we have to look at it from the standpoint of making sure that we're looking at the demographics, and that we as business entities, we as corporations, are looking at the market and saying like, in this particular region, 90%, I'm just going to
example
my community, right? My hometown community, 90% Latino, 7% Black, 3% white, right? That's my hometown. We need to make sure that these institutions are looking at those demographics and really sourcing from those communities, because after all, those communities are borrowing money from the banks. The banks are making money off of them, right? So I think that one of the things that I've seen in recent years, getting back to the banking industry, is that some of them are becoming very conscious about this. We see more banks of color popping up, right? We see more banks. Actually, I was in a conversation with a person about a year ago who is a startup bank of color, but it's a virtual bank. It's not like brick and mortar,
right?
And so he's looking to do more work in the communities of color as well. So I think that the banking institution is really looking at how can they make sure that they level the play field so that they don't get caught up in this historical perceptions of, you get better rates than I get better than I do. And so, but I also want to address that, because there's a state in the country where, when anti-parity laws were passed, it went from spending 14% of the state's budget in procurement to zero within 2 years. And it's taken about 20 years to really get back to where we were pre that law, or where that state is pre that law. But in the interim, in that time frame, businesses of color have lost $14 billion, over $14 billion in growth. So when you think about what that $14 billion means, and you think of the economic impact of that, you can add another 53% to that, right? So you can add another 7 billion to that, which means that these businesses of color were stunted by $21 billion, and therefore they can't grow, they can't create generational wealth, they can't grow their communities. So it has a detrimental effect, not only immediately, but downstream.
I want to get to someone that's hearing this and they're saying, okay, so let me go down my checklist. What is it that I need? So starting off, what do you need to have in place to become a government contractor?
So I think a couple of things. One is you really have to register with the government, right? You have to register with the government. And there's an entity, sam.gov, and you either have to be certified through SBA, you can get an 8A certification through the SBA, or register as an entity with the government through SAM. The 8A program, it's a great program run by the SBA that if you take advantage of it, it can be very, very profitable for everybody. One of our construction firms, they were certified 8A. And I was speaking to him, and he says, hey, Fernando, like first 2 years, I said, okay, I got my certification. I'm qualified as an 8A. I haven't seen much. And then I realized that if I wanted to benefit from this, that I needed to do something. So he began to actually work the 8A program. And he went from 6 million to 36 million within that 9 years. So that's the potential of the 8A program. The federal government program, the registration, really enables you to look at the contracts that are out there and bid on contracts. It is pretty holistic in terms of what's available, but it gives you everything that you need to know, what categories, whether it's professional services, whether it's construction, whether it's maritime, whether it's DOT work, it gives you everything. So the registration with SAM is very, very important. Now, here's the other thing about SAM is that it can take a little while to get registered, and you have to have all your credentials to make sure that you qualify for it. Or there's services that do the registration for you that are inexpensive compared to the potential win on any government contract. But the last thing I'll say about this is that it's really important, Ebony, to have a balance between private sector business and government sector business, right? Because government sector business is very, very consistent, very, very, very much every day you've got something. But in the private sector, it's very cyclical. And so what you see big wins every couple of years. But you have this consistent baseline that you can operate with. So having the two mix, and if one slows down, the other one takes over. If the other one slows down, the other one takes over. So it's a great mix to have.
I want to ask you about the federal side, but for that, just doing a little bit of research, I've seen a lot of people get like the government, some of the infrastructure dollars, when it comes to things like construction. But what if you are more service oriented? So for minority businesses, what areas should they be looking at if they're more service oriented in their business versus goods oriented? What are some of the top areas that you can say these are the places that you need to be looking at?
Ebony, that's a really good question, and I think that from a professional services area, there's several areas where a minority business can participate, right? With all the infrastructure dollars that are going out, all these state funding that's going out, all the city funding, all this county funding, everything that's going out, all of these entities have to have goals and metrics set before they get this funding, right? They have to come up with a program that says, here's how we're going to do this, here's what we're accomplish, here's the goals that we're setting for this. And it's in that goal setting where I think professional services can really play a part. As a professional consultant, I could work for a construction company that needs to do outreach to the minority community. As a minority business, I could provide services to the ports. Again, remember, the ports are federally funded in many respects as well. So in the maritime sector, what does that mean? So from a consultant perspective, I can work as an outreach person. I can work as a business development person. How do we grow out and develop these minority businesses so that they can come in and work under us? As a professional services consultant, we should be going to our State Department of Transportation's, our Office of Equity, because they have money and they're the ones that are responsible for making sure that the goals of the Department of Transportation funding are met, right? So we have to go into all these various sectors and position ourselves to be consultants and reap the benefits of it, because some of these consulting jobs, as an individual or as a company, can pay very, very well, and that's because all this money is available for us to do this.
Okay.
And I'm just one. I'll take one more step. You can also go in as a instructor, a curriculum developer, a technical assistance advisor. There's many areas where professional services can play. Again, with the intention of all of a sudden growing into a section where then you can begin to create your own companies that play directly into the bill.
So that's more which is good information, which is more of the what, but how do you do that? So walk me, how do you do that?
So like everything, there's at the NMSDC, we have 4 pillars that we operate under. The first is certify, right? So certified with the NMSDC, you've got this massive network of 23 organizations across the country that can help you navigate some of these things. The second piece is the develop, right? And how do you develop? So every council across the country, including the national office, has programming that helps build your technical skills, right? So technical assistance, technical skills that help you be a better business person than you were before you started the programming. Then the connectivity, right? The connection, the networking, the direct effect that we can have by introducing you to, say, for example, the director of equity at the state of Washington or the state of Illinois or anything like that. So that's a direct connection. And then the advocacy, right? So we're advocating for minority businesses and educating, but it takes time to build those relationships. It takes time to get to know the people, and it takes time for people to trust you, right? And so remember, while we're trying to create these relationships, other people are trying to anchor their relationships even more, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have a uphill battle that we have to really be very, very consistent and very good at. So we have to get in touch with all the people that have the money. Like I said, the Office of Equity for Department of Transportation, the offices of minority and business executives at the state level as well, at all the federal agencies. So we have to begin to build those relationships with all the supplier diversity executives, because through those relationships, we build trust, and that's where the opportunities begin to develop.
So that's a good point to my next question, is because, so how do you begin to know which agencies that I would, as a business owner, would need to go to? I know there are a lot of third-party organizations that help get, like, I was going to ask you also about certifications. What certifications do I need? But are there free resources that can help you just as well? How do I know where to go, who to reach out to?
So the resources that the NMSDC provides are, the cost of certification. You have to certify to participate, and 2, there's some services that are at a cost, right? It's a fee-based service, and that is only because we also use consultants, right? The NMSDC uses consultants, right, to deliver education and learning. So there's fee-based, but then there's curriculums that are free, right? As being part of the certified entity, there's programs that are free and that you can access anytime. With the federal agencies, most of the services are free. And so, for example, there was a project recently that I was looking at. The state invested about $18,000 in the development of 13 companies, 18,000 per cohort associate. So they build these cohorts. So most of this training and development at this level is paid by the agency. They don't, and it's no out-of-pocket cost, right? Mm-hmm. But it goes to building those relationships so that they know, like, here's an up-and-coming business that if we develop them, they'll be the next generation for us to do business with. And they're intentional about saying, here's the next minority generation that we want to bring into business, doing business, right? Because when I think about it, Ebony, you know, in this country, we do about 15 trillion. Small and minority businesses have access to about $15 trillion worth of business, right? Only 1.6 trillion of those 15 trillion go to minority businesses.
Because when you said we have access, I'm like, do we really have access? Because I was like, because the numbers seem to show a little stuff. There is a number that is available, but when you talk about what that number is available to us, it is very, very daunting. I was looking at, you know, what are some of the things that are keeping, or that people can improve on, or that keeping people from accessing some of these dollars. And I was, you know, looking over what some of those, you talked about access to capital. Another one, even almost associated with that, is to bid on some of these contracts. First, let us not even go about that. Finding out about the contracts, knowing how to bid on those contracts, because I know there are informational settings, there are informational sessions that they have on contracts, but then there's almost like an inner working circle that even happens within that. And doing my research, when it came to minority-owned companies, the challenge is greater challenges in simply obtaining information about these opportunities, but understanding how the bidding process works, details involved in securing the contract. And minority-owned businesses can tend to find themselves excluded from the informal networks of information that influence how the business can be successful in obtaining these contracts.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that's why, you know, a few seconds ago, I said, like, you know, the incumbent is here, right? And so we're trying to influence and build relationships that hopefully will shift the balance a little bit. But you're absolutely right. I think that, you know, there's a long history of businesses doing business with others, right? And we're coming into it in a way to where we're challenging. And so it's always hard to become the incumbent. It's harder to stay the incumbent. And so, you know, the forces get stronger as we get closer to turning the tables, right? But if we do this correctly, and again, it's all relationship based, and we can't be impatient, Ebony. We can't be impatient.
I feel so impatient over here. I'm like, oh my goodness. The numbers were so daunting. When I saw people complaining about, you know, even if I see something with the set aside for a contract between I think they're between like $10,000 and $250,000. But then if I got to pay a grant writer for the contract, sometimes the cost of even getting the contract is more than the contract itself. It's just so many hurdles that we have to go through.
You know, and I'm glad we're having this conversation because, again, the NBDA, the National Minority Supplier Development Council, we have that capacity to help people look to understand, one, where are the contracts, where are the opportunities? Two, is this an opportunity that fits me, right? Because not all opportunities are really good, right? And I think that sometimes in our zeal, we want to take on everything, right? But then we realize, like, oh my God, I'm underwater on this deal because, you know, I really didn't analyze it correctly, right? So we're able to help MBEs, minority businesses, understand, is this a go or a no-go contract? Because if I'm not going to make profit, I'm not going to grow.
Not going to grow at all. And not going
and
to
if,
grow. It's so daunting. Even when you look at, I was reading that even with some of the federal organizations that didn't meet the goals that was set for them to give to minority contractors, my mind was like, okay, well, if they didn't meet the goal, is the money put back into the pot for everybody else? Is there a penalty for them not? And it can't be just because people aren't qualified or you can't find somebody to do the work. There's so many things that have to be tackled when we talk about these contracts.
absolutely. And I think that, again, you know, and if we build these relationships, I mean, we've had minority businesses win contracts because the supplier diversity executives, the people in these businesses, they will take time with you and say, Ebony, this is the language that we speak at this organization. This is how your presentation should speak to us. These are the things that are important. So when you go in and you do presentation, you've already had internal coaching.
Yes.
And that internal coaching can help you really position yourself for success. Again, it's all about, I know it took me 10 years working one deal, 10 years working with one entity before I got a contract with them. And so, so that's why I say we have to be patient, because it was a good contract, right? And so, but it took that long of building relationships and getting the coaching so that we know, here's the certifications that I need. If you're going into the food business, you need to have certain certifications. If you're going into the manufacturing business, you have to have certain certifications. Every industry has a certification that you need to be aware of. The other thing that's important, and before you even get to meetings, is if you need to register with the government, you need to register, because the first thing they're going to ask you is, are you registered? And if you start with no, that's already kind of like a step back, right? So you have to say yes. If you're going to participate, or you're going to interview with a private sector company, are you registered as a supplier? Yes. Let's get to the next conversation, right? So we have to be proactive in terms of how we can continue to build this.
Well, Fernando, thank you so much for coming. There's so many other things. We're running out of time, but there's so many other things I know that we could talk about. But I know the work that you are doing, the work that NMSDC is doing, is amazing. So if you want to get information and workshops and certification information, I encourage you to go to the website. Where can people go to find out more information about the organization?
If they just go to www.nmsdc.org, they'll find our website. And in that website, you'll find the 23 affiliates from across the country. And like if you're in Charlotte, we've got a Carolinas Council. If you're in Florida, we got a Florida Council. If you're in California, we got a couple of councils in California. So it'll guide you to all the regional offices. And believe me, those leaders, those presidents in those councils have relationships with both private and public sector, leverage their organizations.
Fernando Martinez, thank you so much for coming on Business for the Culture. And you are always welcome back. Please let us know if there's anything else that our audience should be in the know about. I know you just wrapped up a national conference, and it was about closing the wealth gap. So best wishes to you and all the work that is coming out of NMSDC.
Thank you, Evan. It's been a pleasure working with you.